BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Now, I just have a couple of announcements and reminders before we truly begin. And the first is that we are closer and closer to our first ever members-only podcast. And if you go through the links in the description box, you will find one for BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88, and that's the website that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday, and soon there will be a release of the members-only podcast for anyone who joins the premium membership via BuyMeACoffee.com, and the membership allows you to have access to bonus features as well as bonus content, and I'm going to be doing a members-only podcast based on some requested topics from the people in the membership program, as well as a blend of some of the behind-the-scenes interactions that have been going on with BlackBoxOnlineRadio, and some great ways that you can help out the channel, aside from the membership, are just by hitting the like button and subscribing. That doesn't cost anything. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone who has done so. But for this Ripper Wednesday, I wanted to get to some of your requested topics, and one of them was responding to the Barlow and Watt documentary series. And this is one that comes to us from 5 Bags of Popcorn, who says, Ned, have you seen the BBC 6-part miniseries called Jack the Ripper, Barlow and Watt's Documentary Investigation? It's on YouTube and it may be of interest to you. Really curious to know what you think of it. And it's from Neil. 5 Bags of Popcorn. Thank you so much. I do appreciate recommendations. And it is 6 parts, so I watched the first part. And if you do want to check this out, it's on the YouTube channel Tellybox. And it features a type of theatrical presentation. At some points it looks like a movie, at some points it looks like a stage play, and there are people in character who are discussing the Jack the Ripper mystery, but they are playing characters. However, there are factual things that we can discuss about Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that possibly committed a crime spree in 1888 that began on August 31st with the murder of Polly Nichols and concluded on November 9th with the murder of Mary Kelly. And the crimes that were discussed were the murders of Annie Chapman, as well as the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, who was also known as Polly. In the first episode, they discussed Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman, and those crimes occurred on August 31st and September 8th. In order, Annie Chapman was the second victim. But as far as the profile that was created, they talked about how the Ripper seemed to be somewhat of an organized serial killer because the women were targeted in a rather stealthy way. And here is something, though, that went into their profile. I mean, let's just go through it. They talked about how this person is a male and he is showing awareness of the area, but based on the way that the wounds were cut, that the Ripper was left-handed. I mean, that was my biggest takeaway from this Barlow and Watt documentary. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, is this a certain, are they certain with this? Is this a certainty? And the honest answer is that it would be very easy to determine if the killer was left-handed or right-handed because of the fact that the women had their throats slashed. And if they did so, then the blade of the knife would be moving in a particular direction. And it's very, very gruesome stuff. But that's something that I immediately thought about, but because I was just thinking that if you had a left-handed ripper, that would reduce the suspect list enormously. Some people believe that even 10% of the population is left-handed. 10%, that means 90% or not. And then you would just try and find a left-handed suspect, or you should only look for left-handed suspects. But in all seriousness, I did a little bit of reading on the subject, and it mostly appears that that is a myth, that is just something that people had believed at the time, or it's a rumor that had been shared, and that they were just simply talking about how it was a popular, widely held belief that the Ripper was left-handed, but it does not appear that it is anything that can be supported by the facts of the case. And as I said, it's a theatrical presentation, and I mean, they are trying to actually discuss the Ripper mystery. If you ever do want to watch this, the Barlow and Watt documentary on Telebox. But that was the thing that stood out to me the most. Another detail that was shared in that series is that out of the 5 women that we've discussed, on this show for the canonical Ripper crimes, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly, the only one that should have been screaming was Liz Stride. And that was one of the first things that they mentioned, that Liz Stride would have been the only victim to scream when she had her interactions with the Ripper, because the other victims would have been strangled first. And for some reason, the Ripper was just unable to get control of Liz Stride, and then he cut her throat and then had to quickly get away. Now, the expectation that people have is that within 15 minutes, the Ripper already found another woman, Catherine Eddowes, and then murdered her in Mitre Square and mutilated her. And if that is true, then this goes back to something that I've said over and over again, that the primary focus of Jack the Ripper is not even to commit murder, it is to mutilate the women, almost in a disemboweling way. Because, as we see from the Thames Torso Killer, there are other types of mutilations out there, and the Thames Torso Killer dismembered the women's, like cutting up the women's bodies, cutting off limbs, and Jack the Ripper was more about cutting out women's organs and mutilating the women by cutting them, hacking them to pieces rather than separating them into specific parts. And of course, the Ripper famously took out organs like a kidney or a heart. But I want to move on from that, because I think that there is something that I do need to clarify, and that is that the reason why I do this show, the Jack the Ripper Report, is because I'm sharing my journey with you guys. I'm sharing things with you about how I learn about this, and I have to give a shout out to Jerry B in the comment section, who might be using his name Jay, and he challenged me on some things that I had made about the murder of Liz Stride, some observations that I had made about the murder of Liz Stride. Jerry B and I corresponded back in 2021 about her story, and I did an Anything Goes Friday episode called just that, The Murder of Long Liz Stride, and I was talking about how, at first, my immediate gut instinct was there was a different killer, that I thought there was a 10% chance that Liz Stride was actually murdered by the same person who murdered Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. And the reason why was, number one, she wasn't mutilated, and number two, it appears that she might have been struck with a different type of knife than the other women. And really what it came down to was, I thought that it was just some type of coincidence. I thought for the year 1888 that there was just a large concentration of homicides in Whitechapel, and that she, unfortunately, was murdered on the same night as another Ripper victim, because, I just thought if the Ripper had such an ease of finding women, why would he, have waited so long to murder Liz Stride? But, okay, 10%, then I had to be honest, and I was like, okay, it's not a 10% chance, it's a 90% chance that Liz Stride was murdered by the Ripper, because when you actually look at the facts in order, that you can see that, all right, maybe you have one serial killer who is committing crimes. And also, I became somewhat pulled into the Frederick Best confession. In 1931, a journalist named Frederick Best confessed to fabricating 2 of the Jack the Ripper communications. The first one, the Dear Boss letter, and the second one, the Saucy Jackie postcard. And the Saucy Jackie postcard is where the Ripper takes credit for the murder of Liz Stride. saying double event. The first one squealed a bit, referring to Liz Stride, the only victim who allegedly was screaming, possibly was screaming. And then I was like, if the Frederick Best confession is true, then almost certainly the murder of Liz Stride was not connected by the Ripper, because her death was fictitiously connected to the story. I mean, that's just it. That's just it. That's why I said that. Because somebody took two unrelated murders and they wrote a letter making people think that they were connected. And to Jerry B., also known as Jay in the comment section, he said, no, I mean, if the Frederick Best confession is true, it doesn't mean almost certainly that the murder of Liz Stride wasn't committed by the Ripper. And absolutely, he's correct. Absolutely. Because what we have to remember is murder was not something that was completely commonplace in Whitechapel, and it's not just like there are vicious people roaming the streets and these crimes happened every single day. For the year 1888, maybe there was an unusual concentration of homicides, but it's easily possible for the Ripper to have committed both of those crimes. And the reason why I was under the misapprehension that the crimes were not widely reported by the newspapers, and also that people didn't share the information via gossip as thoroughly as I gave them credit for, because even into the early 1900s, the way that people learned about a lot of these true crime stories in the area was word of mouth, talking to people. And they would tell the story of what happened, and, it's something that could have been well discussed, well known, and easily shared. So it's entirely possible that even if Frederick Best wrote the Saucy Jackie postcard, that Liz Stride was murdered by the same serial killer who murdered Catherine Eddowes and the other women. However, I would like to jump to a different piece of information. And one of you guys had recommended something to me, and it was responding to a presentation from the criminal profiler Pat Brown, and she has her own YouTube channel, and she has a show called Criminal Profiling with Pat Brown, and she talks about a Ripper suspect named Jacob Levy. And I was going to talk about something completely different for this week's Jack the Ripper report, but when I was watching that Barlow and Watt documentary, right below it on the suggested videos was the criminal profiler Pat Brown talking about Jack the Ripper. And I've mentioned Jacob Levy before, and there's a book out there called Jacob the Ripper, which looks at him as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And Pat Brown actually said that she did a TV show once called, was it Mystery Quest or something? She didn't even seem to remember the title too well. And she said that the book, Jacob the Ripper, actually has a lot of her observations in it, even though she didn't write it. And she thinks that the person watched the show and used a lot of the observations from there, but it's also possible that they just came to the same conclusions. Jacob Levy was a butcher who lived in Whitechapel, and there are just so many ways to respond to her claims. I mean, it would probably take 2 hours to go through everything that she said there and discuss what makes sense to me and what doesn't make sense. One more time, her name is Pat Brown, and she's the author of several books on criminal profiling. One book that she has also authored is called The Murder of Cleopatra, and she also says that she has identified just some historical inaccuracies around the death of Cleopatra that have now been widely accepted by historians. And this sounds like something that is halfway academic and also halfway social commentary. But one point that was made by Pat Brown in her presentation was that Jacob Levy was a butcher who lived in Whitechapel, and he's not an outrageous suspect. He's not a suspect that gets people's attention, and that people want to focus more on the suspects, like Lewis Carroll, like Prince Eddie, or looking at some type of conspiracy involving the royal family. And I have to disagree with that completely. I have to wholeheartedly close the door on that, because I'm somebody who does a YouTube channel where I talk about Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer every Monday, and when I talk about the outrageous suspects, no one wants to hear it. People are just going to be like, well, why on earth are you talking about Lewis Carroll as Jack the Ripper? Obviously he wasn't. You guys in the Black Box Online Radio audience mostly don't want anything to do with that. And just to say that people don't want to discuss her suspect, Jacob Levy, because he was a butcher who lived in the area, as opposed to being a famous person, even like Walter Sickert, who was a painter, then, I mean, go ahead and do this. Make a bunch of YouTube videos talking about an outrageous suspect. I mean, like, we have, like, this Russian conspiracy about how the Russian secret police were involved with the Whitechapel murders. Let's see. Let's think of one that's completely original. Not Russians. How about the Italians? Okay, the Italians. The Empire of Venice. Okay, that the Jack the Ripper crimes, the crimes that have been attributed to Jack the Ripper, were created by the Venetian oligarchs as a way to influence modern culture or something like that. Go ahead, do that. Make up 5 or 6 YouTube videos on that. See how people will respond to you. They'll mostly just be like, no, that's not true. And I do not think that outrageous suspects are available to the public, in some type of easily digestible way. And when I would listen to the show The Opperman Report, hosted by Ed Opperman, he would always talk about the outrageous Zodiac killer suspects. He would ask people, hey, what do you think about Ed Edwards as a Zodiac suspect? What do you think about George Hill Hodel as a Zodiac suspect? And as someone who also discusses these things online, now I can comprehend it, because these theories are popular simply for the fact that they've been shared a lot of times. But people don't think that Ed Edwards was the Zodiac killer en masse. People don't think that George Hodel was the Zodiac killer en masse. Here and there, maybe 5 or 6 people who've contacted me over the years saying they genuinely think that these people were the Zodiac killer. And there are probably 5 or 6 people out there that genuinely think that Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, and Jabberwocky was Jack the Ripper. So I think that that there is just this type of kind of isolationism that people like Pat Brown are trying to do, and they're saying, oh, no one wants to talk about my suspect Jacob Levy because he's not that interesting. He was a butcher who was in Whitechapel, and this is one of the reasons why they would zone in on a butcher as the Jack the Ripper suspect. And that is because he was someone who would have had anatomical knowledge, who would have had familiarity with a knife, and Jacob Levy also had syphilis, which he most likely contracted from a prostitute, and this would have explained his desire to target women in somewhat of a vicious way. Now, as far as this hatred of women would go, and the way that syphilis would function, one story that I discussed previously about Jacob Levy was that he also experienced auditory hallucinations. Like, he would hear voices that would tell him to hurt people, allegedly, according to the stories that have been shared about him online in 2023. And I was saying, okay, I'm not a medical doctor, but that sounds like paranoid schizophrenia. Yes, syphilis can affect people's brain and their judgment. A big thing that they think about with the royal families is that a lot of people had syphilis and then they would intermarry and they would pass on syphilis from one member of the royal family to another, and their children would be born with congenital syphilis, and it's affecting their brains and the way that they're thinking. All of that. I'm sure you've heard some similar stories before, but hearing voices that are telling him to hurt people, is that really what syphilis does? As I said, I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm sharing things with you about how I learn about stuff. I found a post from NIH, the National Institute of Health, that says that there is something called neurosyphilis. 4% to 10% of people with syphilis will develop neurosyphilis, where it begins to affect their brain. And one aspect of neurosyphilis is schizophrenia-like symptoms, including auditory hallucinations. So, Jacob Levy having syphilis could be completely consistent with hearing voices that are telling him to hurt people. He might not have been a clinical schizophrenic. Instead, this is neurosyphilis. And it doesn't seem like it's not extremely common, 4% to 10%, but this is also just some new ground for me as someone who is, as I said, not a medical professional. And even in the Barlow and Watt documentary, they talk about how the Ripper seems to have some type of anatomical knowledge. But the people who are presenting that one point out that anatomical knowledge does not mean a doctor immediately, because they even say, as criminal investigators, they would have a certain degree of anatomical knowledge. It's like saying even the 2 people in this room discussing this would have a higher degree of understanding in relation to anatomy rather than the other people who would be exploring this as lay people. And I completely understand that. And I completely understand why they would think that the Ripper might have been somebody like a butcher. And Jacob Levy is a strong suspect for being Jack the Ripper. Maybe not the strongest suspect ever, only because I don't know that much about him. However, when somebody recommended the presentation from Pat Brown about Jack the Ripper, one point that I knew I was going to find was that she does not believe that Mary Kelly was murdered by Jack the Ripper, that she believes that there was a serial killer who operated in 1888 and that he was responsible for the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, but he did not murder Mary Kelly. What would be the evidence for this? Well, let's go through it real fast. Number one, there's an enormous time gap from the murder of Catherine Eddowes to the murder of Mary Kelly. It's about 5 weeks. It's September 30th of 1888 to November 9th of 1888. And you would think if somebody's mental state is getting out of control that they would have just been more inclined to commit murder, but there could be numerous explanations for that. Number two, she believes that the actions of the murders that took place with the first 4 women that we've discussed are about someone who showed a certain degree of composure and also familiarity with mutilations and organs, the way that a butcher would cut somebody up. And what she believes happened is that the murder of Mary Kelly was a copycat. It was somebody pretending to be Jack the Ripper, but because that person was not a butcher, he was much more ferocious and vicious. And I'm going to be very honest with you, I might be completely wrong about this, but I'm tempted to think that the murderer of Mary Kelly was high on drugs, maybe even cocaine at the time. I mean, Arthur Conan Doyle even once wrote that Sherlock Holmes loved the cocaine needle. This was something that people did back at the time, just someone who would have had the energy to murder Mary Kelly and eviscerate her body that way. But what she shows is that there's a certain degree of disorganization with Mary Kelly's killer, that yes, the organs are stripped out and her heart's removed. And I mean, this is the stuff that I don't want to misstate, because I swear that I've read this somewhere, but I don't want to say anything inaccurate. It said Mary Kelly's heart was removed and taken, her uterus was cut out and placed by her neck, and famously, you can even see this in the photo of her body, her intestines were pulled out and placed on the nightstand table that was next to her bed. The murder of Mary Kelly is also the only crime that took place indoors, and, I mean, it's definitely a stronger mutilation. Now, this is going to tie in to the next observation made by Pat Brown, and that is that the person who murdered the first 4 women was not an aristocrat or upperclassman. It was somebody who was of the lower class, maybe a working class individual like a butcher. And I think that I don't really like the reasoning too much on this. It's because a lot of the women who were working who were murdered by Jack the Ripper were lower class women as well. And she thought that an aristocrat or upperclassman would have had access, well, to higher end women. And I think that this is based on an enormous amount of assumptions. And that is that there could be a specific reason why the women were targeted. And I mean, to the credit of Pat Brown, maybe we don't know what that specific reason is, but when you read Stephen Knight's The Final Solution, and that's one that I watched the documentary version of, mind you, it talks about the women who were murdered could have been targeted because they had knowledge of a particular event involving the royal family. Again, I watched the documentary version, but that's available here on YouTube for free. And even when I was watching the movie Jack the Ripper from 1959, although that is a dramatization, it also shows that there's an upperclassman who is targeting the women for a specific reason. There's a specific reason why he's going after these women, and he's trying to find one particular woman named Mary Clark. They changed the name of Mary Kelly to Mary Clark for the movie, and again, she's murdered indoors. And, I mean, it's just based on the assumption that the Ripper was only going after women. Maybe you're saying, okay, you're going to stick to the facts. Fact, the women were targeted, and it's just an assumption that they were targeted for some type of cold, methodical, and calculating reason. But the possibility still exists in an unsolved murder case. And I'm just going to get to the heart of the issue. I think that it's an uphill battle to convince me that the murder of Mary Kelly was a copycat out of all the crimes there. But I'm always going to approach people with an open mind. and she's showing about how there are all these differences with the murder of Mary Kelly, the time frame, the way that the crime was committed. It's indoors, but how many times have you guys heard me say this? I have to go back to Dr. Anthony LaPaula, who just said that this is completely consistent with serial killer behavior. For a serial killer who's going to commit a crime spree, the first 3 nights of activity are going to be done one way, and on the next night, on the 4th night of activity, the crime will be committed in a different way, because the killer's trying to confuse people. And if this guy, Jacob Levy, had syphilis, then the neurosyphilis, which is affecting his brain in some type of schizophrenia-like way, again, not schizophrenia, but schizophrenia-like symptoms, you could see how he would be having some type of wavering levels of mental control. So overall, I think that, I think that her conclusions are somewhat defendable, but absolutely I'm not convinced 100%. But believe it or not, one person who believes that the murder of Mary Kelly is unrelated to Jack the Ripper is Thomas Henry Horan, who's the author of The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, which was made into a documentary for Peacock recently. And he used to have a channel called Professor Dad, which has been renamed, and I was a guest on that show once as part of a panel discussion, and we were talking about Jack the Ripper, and what he said was that his theory is that the Ripper murders were a hoax, where the women were murdered by the London street gangs, and that someone, the journalist Frederick Best, wrote the letters that united the crimes. Someone was taking credit for murders that he didn't commit, and the murder of Mary Kelly was not committed by a street gang. It was an unrelated murder, which would be halfway in line with Pat Brown, halfway on its own, because she believes that there was a serial killer who murdered the people that murdered Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, and the murder of Mary Kelly was unrelated. Now, one other reason why she thinks the murder of Mary Kelly was unrelated is because there's a witness named George Hutchinson who was standing outside of Mary Kelly's residence and saw a man enter the room with Mary Kelly, and he appeared to be very well dressed. And again, she thought that that was inconsistent with the behavior of the Ripper in his previous activities, targeting women who are mostly poor. And we're talking about people who might even not even have the money to pay for a bed, so they have to get drunk on gin and pass out on the street. That was something that was commonly done in Whitechapel at the time. Okay, so that is based on the fact that you think that George Hutchinson told the truth. It's based on the assumption that George Hutchinson told the truth. And when I did the episode discussing him, one of the leading theories is that George Hutchinson lied. He just made up the story because he wanted to soak in the spotlight, bathe in the attention of it, if you will. And one person who supports that theory is the graphic novelist Alan Moore, who worked on From Hell. Just looking at this guy seems to be telling a very wild story. And back to Thomas Warren, of all people, who states that, now wait a second, when people make these psychological profiles, very frequently, they're doing this about a fictional character, whether it's Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac Killer. And he said this because he is looking at how, okay, you just present some people with 5 different murders, and you're like, okay, well, now what's the psychological profile of the murderer? Well, number one, that would be based on the assumption that the same person committed all of the crimes, or you would just be looking for connections among 5 murders. You could pull any 5 murders out of the history of the world and be like, okay, now, what kind of person would have committed these? And to the credit of Pat Brown, she does challenge the narrative that the murder of Mary Kelly was not committed by the same Ripper as who committed the first 4, but it's based already on some type of leading interpretation of the evidence. Now, one final note about Pat Brown is she does not believe that the murder of Martha Tabram was committed by Jack the Ripper, and I'm not 100% convinced. I'm about 80% convinced that the Ripper committed the murder of Martha Tabram, which occurred before the murder of Polly Nichols, where Martha Tabram was stabbed 39 times. And the reason why she doesn't believe that Martha Tabram was murdered by the Ripper is that she was murdered at 5:30 a.m. in August of 1888, and in August, that would have almost have been sunrise, and she thinks that the Ripper would have completely worked in the dark No chance of the sun coming up. I mean, we're talking about 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., maybe even just well after nightfall in total darkness. She does not think the Ripper would have had any opportunities to commit crimes when the sun would have been about to come up, because she thinks that the Ripper wanted to be stealthy at night. And that is, I think, a strong piece of evidence. When I first learned about the murder of Martha Tabram, I was like, what are people talking about? This woman was stabbed 39 times, but she wasn't disemboweled the way that the other victims were. Yet, I did have to be aware that this could be one serial killer who was slowly escalating in his behavior. But the ultimate challenge question is, what do you think about the murder of Mary Kelly? What do you think about the interpretation of the evidence that Mary Kelly was not killed by Jack the Ripper, but by a copycat? I mean, as I said, that's a very big theory and a very big claim to make. However, I mean, I've discussed several of the reasons that she has brought forward. Do you think the evidence suggests that she was murdered by Jack the Ripper, or that she was murdered by an unrelated person who overdid it, who used a certain amount of overkill in Mary Kelly because of various reasons? Could have been high on drugs, could have been mentally ill, could have specifically targeted her, and that's what Pat Brown ultimately said, that she thought that Mary Kelly was a revenge killing, that somebody murdered her out of jealousy because she had been with other men, and that this was a specific target, specific hit. But what is your interpretation of the events? And thank you so much to the people who have recommended documentaries and TV shows for this series. I would love to read more about the Ripper case and watch more of your suggestions and recommendations. Please put your ideas in the comments section below if you have something to share. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNet88 over on Instagram. And I'll see you over there. Until next time.